The gavel cracked like a gunshot through the hushed courtroom. Lola McCarthy stood with her back straight, her charcoal blazer perfectly pressed, her eyes gleaming with triumph as the judge's voice echoed through the chamber. Case dismissed. The words hung in the air like a verdict from heaven itself. Behind her, her husband Jeffrey McCarthy sat frozen at the prosecution's table, his hands trembling against the polished wood, confusion flooding his features like a man drowning in shallow water. Lola turned slightly, just enough to catch Jeffrey's eye. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face. Guilt? Regret? But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the cool mask of professional victory. She gathered her papers with deliberate precision while her client, a silver-haired executive in a suit worth more than most people's cars, clapped her shoulder with enthusiasm that made Jeffrey's stomach turn. This was the first time in their 8 years of marriage that Lola and Jeffrey had faced each other across a courtroom. It would also be the last time their marriage would mean anything at all. Jeffrey pushed himself up from his chair, his legs unsteady beneath him. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. His head felt like it was stuffed with cotton, his thoughts moving through molasses. He'd felt fine that morning over breakfast when Lola had kissed his cheek and handed him his coffee with that familiar smile that still made his heart skip. But now, standing in this courtroom where he'd just suffered the most humiliating defeat of his career, nothing made sense. The evidence had been solid. Airtight. He'd spent 3 months building this case against Meridian Industries for environmental violations that had poisoned an entire community's water supply. Children had gotten sick. Families had been destroyed. And now those same families sat in the gallery behind him, their faces reflecting the same confusion and devastation he felt churning in his gut. Lola walked past him without a word, her heels clicking against the marble floor with a rhythm that sounded like victory drums. Jeffrey wanted to call out to her, to ask her what had happened, but his tongue felt thick and his thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm. He watched her disappear through the courtroom doors, followed by her client and the parade of corporate lawyers who'd sat on her side like an army of well-dressed soldiers. Outside the courthouse, news cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. Lola stood on the steps with Jason Hardwick, the CEO of Meridian Industries, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder as he praised her brilliance to anyone who would listen. Lola McCarthy is the finest defense attorney in this city, he proclaimed, his voice booming with satisfaction. She saved our company today. Saved our reputation. Saved everything we've built. Jeffrey emerged from the courthouse 20 minutes later to find the cameras gone and the steps empty except for the families whose justice had just been stolen from them. A woman approached him, tears streaming down her weathered face. "My grandson is still in the hospital," she said, her voice breaking. "You promised us justice, Mr. McCarthy." The words cut deeper than any blade. Jeffrey opened his mouth to respond, to apologize, to explain that something had gone catastrophically wrong, but what could he say? That he'd lost. That somehow, impossibly, his case had fallen apart in his hands like wet paper. That his own wife had demolished him in front of the world. He drove home in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. The fog in his head was beginning to clear, replaced by a burning question that consumed every thought. How had Lola done it? How had she turned his ironclad case into nothing? The house was dark when he arrived. Lola hadn't come home yet. She was probably celebrating at some expensive restaurant with Jason Hardwick and the other partners at Blackstone and Associates, toasting her victory with champagne that cost more than those families' medical bills. Jeffrey stood in their kitchen, the same kitchen where they'd shared breakfast that morning, where Lola had handed him his coffee with that smile. His eyes fell on the coffee maker, and something cold slithered down his spine. He walked to it slowly, examining the counter, the cup she'd given him, the coffee grounds in the trash. His hands were shaking as he pulled out his phone and called an old friend from medical school who now ran a private lab. "Marcus," he said, his voice tight. "I need a favor. A blood test. Tonight." 3 hours later, Jeffrey sat in Marcus's office, staring at the results that confirmed what his gut had been screaming since the moment that gavel fell. Benzodiazepines. A significant dose, enough to impair cognitive function, memory, focus. Enough to make a brilliant prosecutor stumble through a case like a first-year law student. "Someone drugged you, Jeff," Marcus said quietly, his face grave. "This morning, based on the timeline. With your coffee, probably, or your breakfast." The room seemed to tilt. Jeffrey's mind raced back through the morning. Lola handing him his cup with that smile. Lola kissing his cheek. Lola wishing him luck with words that now sounded like poison. "You'll do great today, honey. I believe in you." She'd believed in something, all right. She'd believed she could drug her own husband to win a case. But even that wasn't all of it. Over the next week, Jeffrey threw himself into investigating what had happened in that courtroom. He reviewed every document, every piece of evidence, every witness statement with eyes that now saw clearly. And what he found made the drugging seem almost merciful in comparison. Evidence had been tampered with. Lab reports that had been pristine in his files somehow appeared in court with altered data. Chain of custody documents had been forged. Witness statements had been modified so subtly that only someone looking with the eyes of betrayal would notice. Lola hadn't just drugged him. She'd systematically dismantled his entire case while he'd slept beside her every night, trusting her, loving her, believing in the sanctity of their marriage. Jeffrey sat in his office late one night, the city lights glowing through his window, and felt something inside him break. It wasn't a clean break, like snapping a pencil. It was a splintering, a shattering of everything he'd believed about the woman he'd married, about the life they'd built together, about the promises they'd made to each other. He remembered their wedding day. Lola in her white dress, tears in her eyes as she'd promised to honor him, to cherish him, to stand beside him through everything. He remembered the night he'd proposed, down on one knee in the rain because he couldn't wait another second to ask her to be his wife. He remembered 1,000 small moments, breakfasts and dinners and lazy Sunday mornings, all of them now tainted by the knowledge of what she'd done. When Lola finally came home that night, after another late celebration dinner with her firm, she found Jeffrey sitting in the dark living room, waiting for her. "Jeff," she said, flipping on the light. "Why are you sitting in the dark? Are you okay?" He looked at her, this woman he'd loved for nearly a decade, and saw a stranger. "How could you do it?" he asked quietly. Something flickered in her eyes. "Do what?" "Don't," he said, his voice hardening. "Don't insult me more than you already have. I know what you did. The drugs. The evidence tampering. All of it." The color drained from Lola's face. For a long moment, she just stood there, her purse hanging from her hand, her coat still on. Then, slowly, she set down her things and walked to the couch, sitting on the edge like a woman preparing to confess her sins. "Jason told me I had to win," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The firm's biggest client. If I lost, they'd drop us. I'd lose my partnership track. Everything I've worked for my entire career would be gone. So you destroyed me instead." Jeffrey's voice cracked. "You drugged me, Lola. You poisoned your own husband. You tampered with evidence in a case about children being poisoned. Do you understand what you've done?" Tears began streaming down Lola's face. "I didn't want to do it. I swear, Jeff, I didn't want to. But Jason kept pushing, and the senior partners kept pushing, and I couldn't lose. I couldn't fail. Those families needed justice," Jeffrey said, standing now, his whole body trembling with rage and heartbreak. "Those children are still sick. That community's water is still poisoned. And you helped the people responsible walk free because you couldn't fail. Because your career was more important than their lives. More important than us." "I'm sorry," Lola sobbed, reaching for him. "Jeff, I'm so sorry. I made a mistake. A horrible mistake. But we can fix this. We can work through this." Jeffrey stepped back from her touch like she was made of fire. "Fix this? You committed multiple felonies, Lola. You violated every oath you ever took as a lawyer. You betrayed me in the worst way imaginable. There's no fixing this. Please," she begged, falling to her knees. "Please, Jeff. I love you. I made a terrible mistake, but I love you. We can get past this." He looked down at her, this woman who'd once been his entire world, and felt nothing but a vast, aching emptiness. "No," he said quietly. "We can't." Jeffrey walked out that night and checked into a hotel. He didn't sleep. He lay awake in the darkness, his mind racing with plans that grew more detailed with each passing hour. Lola had destroyed him professionally and personally. She'd helped poison a community and let the guilty walk free. She'd drugged him, manipulated evidence, and shattered every sacred trust between them. And now, with the cold clarity of betrayal, Jeffrey McCarthy decided that justice would be served after all. The next 6 weeks were a masterclass in patience and precision. Jeffrey moved through his days with the calm efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and why. He contacted every person who'd worked on the Meridian Industries case. He spoke with lab technicians who remembered unusual requests for document alterations. He found the pharmacy records showing Lola's prescription for the benzodiazepines she'd claimed were for her own anxiety. He built his case the way he'd built every case of his career, brick by careful brick, until the structure was unassailable. He also reached out to other clients Lola had represented, digging through public records, court documents, anything that might reveal a pattern of unethical behavior. What he found made his stomach turn. The Meridian case wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the first time she'd been desperate enough to drug her own husband. Lola called him constantly during those weeks. She sent texts that turned from apologetic to pleading to angry to heartbroken and back again. She showed up at his new apartment, begging for a chance to explain, to make amends, to save their marriage. Each time, Jeffrey looked at her with eyes that held no warmth and sent her away. "Why are you doing this?" she'd screamed at his door during her last visit. "Why won't you even talk to me?" Jeffrey had opened the door just wide enough to look at her tear-stained face. "Because talking won't bring back what you destroyed," he'd said simply. "Nothing will." The revenge Jeffrey planned wasn't hot and explosive. It was cold and methodical, designed to dismantle Lola's life with the same precision she'd used to dismantle his case. He filed formal complaints with the State Bar Association, providing evidence of her misconduct. He contacted the judge who'd presided over the Meridian case with proof of evidence tampering. He reached out to investigative journalists who'd been following corporate corruption cases. And then, when everything was in place, he did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He filed charges against his own wife. The news broke on a Tuesday morning. Lola was having coffee with Jason Hardwick and 2 senior partners at Blackstone and Associates when her phone began lighting up with notifications. She read the headlines with growing horror, her coffee cup slipping from her fingers and shattering on the marble floor of the expensive cafe. Prominent defense attorney charged with evidence tampering, drugging prosecutor husband. McCarthy v. McCarthy, courtroom marriage ends in criminal charges. Blackstone and Associates lawyer faces disbarment after poisoning spouse to win case. Jason's face turned purple with rage as he read over her shoulder. "You drugged your husband," he hissed. "You tampered with evidence. Do you have any idea what you've done to this firm?" Lola couldn't speak. She could only stare at her phone, at the evidence Jeffrey had compiled and released to the media. Photos of prescriptions. Testimony from lab technicians. Witness statements. Blood test results. Everything laid out for the world to see. Within hours, Blackstone and Associates issued a statement terminating her employment. By evening, the State Bar had suspended her license pending investigation. By the next morning, every client she'd ever represented was filing complaints or demanding case reviews. The preliminary hearing was held 3 weeks later. Lola sat at the defendant's table, a position she'd never imagined being in, with a public defender she'd never imagined needing. Across the aisle, Jeffrey sat in the gallery, his face expressionless as prosecutors laid out the case against his wife. When their eyes met, Lola saw nothing but emptiness where love used to live. She'd destroyed that love as surely as she'd destroyed his case, and the weight of that realization was more crushing than any prison sentence could ever be. The prosecutor, a woman named Sarah Chin who'd always respected Jeffrey's work, presented the evidence with devastating efficiency. The defendant, Lola McCarthy, engaged in a calculated scheme to defeat her husband in court by any means necessary. She drugged him with prescription medication the morning of trial. She systematically tampered with evidence, including lab reports and witness statements. She violated her oath as an attorney and her vows as a wife. The people asked for the maximum penalty under the law. Lola's public defender tried to argue for leniency, painting a picture of a woman under enormous professional pressure who'd made terrible mistakes. But the evidence was overwhelming. The judge, the same one who'd presided over the Meridian case, looked at Lola with unconcealed disgust. "Mrs. McCarthy," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I've known you for years. I've watched you practice law in my courtroom. I never imagined you capable of this level of betrayal and dishonesty. The charges against you represent not just crimes, but a fundamental violation of everything our justice system stands for. The trial itself took 2 weeks. Every day, Lola sat in that defendant's chair while prosecutors systematically destroyed her reputation, her credibility, her entire life. Witnesses testified about altered documents. Expert witnesses explained how the drugs she'd given Jeffrey would have impaired his abilities. Lab technicians detailed the tampering they'd been pressured to perform. And through it all, Jeffrey sat in the gallery, watching the woman he'd once loved be torn apart by the same justice system they'd both sworn to serve. The night before closing arguments, Jeffrey stood outside the courthouse in the rain, smoking a cigarette even though he'd quit years ago. Lola's brother found him there. "She's destroyed, Jeff," Michael said quietly. "She's lost everything. Her career, her reputation, her marriage. Isn't that enough? Can't you drop the charges?" Jeffrey took a long drag of his cigarette and watched the smoke disappear into the rain. "She poisoned me," he said flatly. "She helped the people who poison children walk free. She violated everything we both believed in. And you want me to let her walk away?" "I want you to remember that you loved her once," Michael said, his voice breaking. "I want you to remember the woman she was before all this." "That woman doesn't exist anymore," Jeffrey said, crushing out his cigarette. "Maybe she never did." The jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they returned, Lola stood on trembling legs as the forewoman read the verdict. "On the charge of evidence tampering, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of assault with a controlled substance, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to obstruct justice, we find the defendant guilty." Lola collapsed into her chair as the judge set a sentencing date. In the gallery, Jeffrey sat motionless, his face carved from stone. He'd won. He'd gotten his revenge. Justice had been served. So why did he feel like he was dying inside? The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. During that time, Lola stayed with her parents, a broken shell of the ambitious lawyer she'd once been. She'd lost her license, her job, her marriage, and soon she'd lose her freedom. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd destroyed Jeffrey to preserve, was gone. She wrote him letters during those weeks. Long, desperate letters full of apologies and explanations and pleas for forgiveness. Jeffrey read each one and felt nothing but aching emptiness. "I loved you more than anything," one letter said. "But I loved success more. I loved winning more. I loved the respect and the money and the power more. And now I have nothing. Not even you. Especially not you. I'm so sorry, Jeff. I'm so desperately, impossibly sorry. But sorry doesn't fix what I've broken, does it?" On the day of sentencing, the courtroom was packed. Families from the Meridian case sat in the gallery, hungry for justice. Legal professionals who'd known both Lola and Jeffrey crowded the seats, witnessing the final chapter of a tragedy that had captivated the legal community. The judge listened to impact statements. He heard from the families whose water had been poisoned, whose children had gotten sick. He heard from Jeffrey, who spoke in a voice devoid of emotion about professional betrayal and personal devastation. He heard from Lola's mother, who begged for mercy for her daughter. Then the judge spoke. "Mrs. McCarthy, your actions represent a fundamental betrayal of the legal profession and of human decency. You poisoned your husband. You tampered with evidence in a case involving the poisoning of children. The irony is not lost on this court. I hereby sentence you to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Your law license is permanently revoked. This court is adjourned." The gavel fell like an executioner's axe. Lola turned to look at Jeffrey one last time before the bailiffs took her away. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and in that moment, they both saw the same thing. The ruins of everything they'd built together. The ashes of love turned to hate, turned to hollow victory, turned to shared devastation. "I'm sorry," she mouthed. "I love you." Jeffrey said nothing. He just watched as they led her away in handcuffs, this woman who'd once been his entire world, now a convicted felon who'd destroyed both their lives in pursuit of a victory that had meant nothing in the end. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions that Jeffrey ignored. He walked to his car in the rain, got inside, and sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. He'd gotten his revenge. He'd exposed her crimes and ensured she faced justice. He'd won. But winning felt like losing. Justice felt like devastation. And revenge tasted like ashes in his mouth. That night, Jeffrey sat alone in his apartment, holding their wedding photo. He looked at their smiling faces, at the hope and love and promise in their eyes, and felt tears streaming down his face for the first time since this nightmare began. He'd destroyed the woman he loved to serve justice. She'd destroyed him to serve ambition. And now they were both destroyed, separately, irrevocably, completely. Jeffrey set down the photo and poured himself a drink. He thought about those families from the Meridian case, who'd finally gotten their justice in the form of a new trial that he'd fought for while building his case against Lola. He thought about the community whose water was being cleaned, about the children who were recovering. He'd done the right thing. He knew he'd done the right thing. But the right thing had cost him everything. 3 years later, Jeffrey stood outside the federal prison on the day of Lola's release. He didn't know why he'd come. Maybe to see if there was anything left of the woman he'd loved. Maybe to see if there was anything left of himself. Lola walked out through those gates looking smaller, older, broken in ways that had nothing to do with prison. When she saw Jeffrey waiting, she stopped, surprise and pain flooding her features. They stood there in the parking lot, two people who'd once promised to spend their lives together, now strangers bound only by shared destruction. "Why did you come?" Lola asked finally. Jeffrey didn't have an answer. He'd asked himself the same question 100 times during the drive here. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'm sorry," she said again, the same words she'd said 1,000 times. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." "I know," Jeffrey said quietly. "I'm sorry too." "For what?" Bitterness crept into her voice. "You were right. I was wrong. You got your justice." "I'm sorry that we destroyed each other," Jeffrey said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry that we couldn't find another way. I'm sorry that loving you and hating you feel exactly the same now." Tears streamed down Lola's face. "We were supposed to be forever." "We were," Jeffrey agreed. "Until we weren't." They stood there for another moment, two broken people in a parking lot, surrounded by the ruins of everything they'd built and destroyed together. Then Lola turned and walked away, toward a friend's car waiting to take her to wherever broken lawyers go when their lives are over. Jeffrey watched her leave and felt the same emptiness he'd felt every day since that courtroom victory that had tasted like defeat. He'd gotten his revenge. Justice had been served. The right thing had been done. And none of it mattered because the person he'd been before all of this, the man who'd loved Lola McCarthy with his whole heart, was gone forever. He drove home in silence, the same silence that had filled his life for 3 years, the same silence that would fill it for however many years he had left. He'd won the battle and lost everything that mattered. She'd lost the battle and lost everything, period. There were no winners in this story. Only survivors. Only ghosts of people who'd once loved each other enough to promise forever. Only the hollow echo of what happens when ambition and betrayal and revenge poison everything they touch, leaving nothing behind but regret and ruins and the question that neither of them would ever be able to answer. Was justice worth the price they'd both paid? Was revenge worth the cost of destroying themselves to destroy each other? Jeffrey would spend the rest of his life not knowing. So would Lola. And that uncertainty, that eternal question mark, was perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you would have done in Jeffrey's position. Was he right to pursue justice, or should he have chosen mercy? Like this video if you want more complex moral stories that make you question everything. Thanks for watching until the end.